Welcome again to GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises. And look at the 5 we have here today. We had a stretch where we added Philip. So thank you for being with us, Pastor Philip, and buying in. But then we didn't have Pastor Viana for a while. So glad to have everybody here.
Thank you.
So Pastor Dan from Garden Grove for a few more weeks. Pastor Shifra here at Campus Hill. Pastor Philip, Loma Melinda. Pastor Viana from Calamasa. And our scholar, Dr. John Pauline, Loma Linda. This is God's Prophetic Surprises. We're doing Revelation. I have a 1-minute introduction. I'd like to hear your all thought quickly. Just last night, I was at a dinner. I'm having all these last suppers because I'm in my last stretch as a pastor. And these people showed us a video from the Middle East where locusts are taking over the whole area. Pictures of trees just covered with locusts. And they specifically used the phrase, is this a biblical fulfillment? Do things like this fit into the scheme at all? Or are they really just an anomaly that has nothing to do with the Bible at all?
Well, I think you have to keep in mind that locusts are on a 14 or 17-year cycle. So this has happened before. And so the question is there any reason to see this particular locust infestation as greater or more prophetically significant than any other? I'm not aware of such.
So their answer is no in any specific sense.
Well, unless there's compelling reason for multiple reasons, yeah. Locust infestations are, off and on continually in the Middle East, and I think some of us have experienced them in North America as well. A certain year they show up, 4 weeks later pretty much they're gone,
like
and that's it. So
okay. All right, well, we'll get that out of the way. We thought we would try to go back to chapter 9 verse 15. If you got a Bible, would like to pick up with us, this passage has had a lot of debate about this time. And without Pastor Viana here last time, we thought we really needed to have you give a final definitive word on what this means. Now, so if you have a Bible, we're in the 6th trumpet, and we're looking at verse 15. And the 4 angels who had been kept ready for this very hour and day and month and year were released to kill 1/3 of mankind. And we reviewed that early Adventist history comes out of a time when there were people who made predictions. And they added those times, that month, a year, and a month, and a day. And they added that up and came up with this time period and made predictions, and they thought that those time predictions came true in the fall of the Ottoman Empire. We expressed some reservations about that interpretation. So you want to pick us up, John, and just sort of summarize quickly where we were at the end of the last show?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to remember that, in a sense, all of us speak as both scholars and believers at the same time. And as a believer, you make certain commitments that are part of a group, a particular denomination, for example. And you make that commitment. I believe we're all Seventh-day Adventists here around this table. And so we have certain commitments that we make as Seventh-day Adventists. At the same time, however, as scholars, we want those commitments to prove to be accurate and true.
Sure.
And so you may make some commitments that you're 100% certain, and that evidence seems to suggest are 100% certain, but other commitments are not 100%, and maybe therefore should not be at the center of our consciousness. One of the commitments that some of our pioneers made was the idea that Revelation 9:15 represents a period of 391 plus years in the course of Turkish history. Now, just right off the top, that would not seem to be at the center of our faith. It seems like an important historical observation, but is that crucial to the center of our faith? As a scholar, I would say, when you come to the text, the problem here is that in normal Greek, this is a point in time rather than a period of time. Now, I'm just curious, what translation do you have, Viana?
I have the RSV.
Okay, what does that say for 9:15?
So the 4 angels were released who had been held ready for the hour, the day, the month, and the year to kill 1/3 of mankind.
Okay, so ready for the hour, the day, the month, and year. That's a little bit ambiguous, but it leans toward the idea of a point in time.
Yes.
The NIV, which I think Pastor Dan was reading, says this very hour, day, month, and year. That strongly emphasized the point in time. What do you have, Philip?
I have the English Standard Version, and mine says, so the 4 angels who had been prepared for the hour, day, month, and year were released.
Okay. My representation of the ESV says the hour, the day, the month, and the year. Yours does not say that. Yours leaves off the does?
Oh, no, it does say that. I was just...
Oh, you just slurred over it.
Summarizing, you know.
How dare
You see, that's
you.
significant because those aren't there in the original.
Yeah, added.
In the original, it says, for the hour, day, month, and year. And so that, let me just make sure
So
for
what's...
the hour and day and month and year. And when you do that in the Greek, it implies that all 4 are subject to that same article, that the 4 are united in some way. So that's
I
what
was
that
implying the
expression-
Greek, you see, when I said that. I
There you
took
go.
off all the articles.
Yeah.
I could see through the text.
I love the English Standard Version, and I favor it many, many times. But on this particular case, it's actually inserting into the translation things that aren't there in the original. The NIV here is stronger when it says this very hour, day, month, and year. Shows the point in time. It doesn't put the articles where they don't exist. What do you have, Shifra?
The same as the NIV, this very hour and day and month and year.
Okay, and what's that translation?
It's the NIV.
It is the okay. So we have that. So here comes the question then. I like to say that what the commitments that you make need to be exegetically defensible. They don't have to be exegetically compelling. In other words, you don't have to be able to prove that the original writer of this biblical passage was a Seventh-day Adventist. All right? And he understood the whole background and had it all there. You don't need to prove that. Most of the time you can't. But you do, it needs to be defensible. In other words, if your point of view contradicts the Scripture, then you have a problem.
Right.
And this is one case where, from the best knowledge of Scripture that I'm aware of, you'd have a contradiction. So then, for Seventh-day Adventists, the question comes, if this does not sound exegetically, why does Ellen White quote this verse with that period of time in the book Great Controversy?
Take 1 minute and summarize in case someone just got to this show and did not see it last week.
Yeah.
Josiah Litch made a prediction the Ottoman Empire would come to an end. And they got a headline in the newspaper that seemed to fit that, and that was very thrilling to the people at the time.
Yeah.
Of course, we had news headlines going on a boat for months around the world before it showed up here. So there's some issues with that. So Ellen White reflects that in Great Controversy.
Right.
The story of that. Was she given a prophetic approval to that, or was she just telling a story of what people perceived?
And I guess it depends on how you understand that came together. If you have the idea as a Seventh-day Adventist that Ellen White was sitting in her study, looking up, and there she saw specific words and wrote them down straight from heaven. All right? If that is your view, then you will take every word a little bit more seriously than otherwise. What we know today from the testimony of those that were with her, if you go to Elmshaven, you will find that there are outbuildings, behind her house, and that you had up to 12 staff living in those buildings. And a large proportion of those staff were people who assisted in the writing of books. And they would gather materials, etc. And that Ellen White would work with them on some of these books like Great Controversy, would work with them, and they would have discussions back and forth. And actually, Prescott, who is one of the leaders of that group, indicated later on that he advised her to drop out the Litch piece, that it is causing more problems than it's helping. And we don't know why, but it was included in the 1911 edition. So she says at the beginning of that edition that the historical parts are there as illustrations of the big thing that God is doing in the world. How did Litch's prediction play a role? Why would it even be there? It's necessary because up until that point, most pastors who had heard the message did not take the prophetic line seriously, that Jesus is coming in 1843 or 1844. They did not take it seriously. They did not like the method that Miller was using. And Josiah Litch says, if you follow that method, something dramatic is going to happen on August 11, 1840. And what was reported in the news on that day was dramatic enough that a lot of pastors converted to the methodology and became supporters of the Miller movement. So you can't tell the Miller story without this. The question comes, would God be behind an unhelpful prediction? One that historically we cannot demonstrate today. Exegetically, we have difficulty demonstrating, and the evidence for that is that Litch himself rejected that view later on.
But did it have a purpose at the time? I think that's what we have to consider. Was there a purpose for that? And I think that was one thing we mentioned, that regardless of the fact, it still fulfilled some spurring on of the gospel to go forth in a way that needed to happen. Just as when, hey, a crisis in the United States or around the world happens, an earthquake, people all of a sudden wake up in a way. I think that the only issue we have here is that it seemed as though what was happening out in history was then attached to a biblical time frame and scripture, and all of a sudden that now provides a little bit of confusion, whereas sometimes these isolated events in history may just hold on their own and they're not attached to a biblical interpretation or view.
I'm thinking of like when the disciples came to Jesus and they had heard other people were preaching the gospel, you know, and using the name of Jesus, and they were like, should we tell them to stop because they're not one of us, right? They're not like, I imagine that they were not saying exactly what the disciples would have said, or the disciples didn't feel like they were represented. And Jesus, what did Jesus say, right? Like, let them, if they preach my name, let them preach, right? So I wonder if, like, because it was spurring on the gospel, it had a purpose, even though maybe it wasn't exactly as perfectly put together as the disciples would have liked. Is that a good example?
That's a great example. I think that's a great example. That's kind of where my brain's
going.
When you read the Bible, you discover that God often works in messy ways to accomplish his purpose, such as telling David, you know, I gave you your wives. Does God approve of polygamy? It's certainly not the ideal. But in the real situation, God takes responsibility even for David's polygamy. Now that, I wouldn't have advised God that, but he didn't ask me. and I think the point is simply that Litch apparently, as I understand it, Litch, in a sense, put the whole movement in jeopardy. If nothing had happened to support his view, it would have been devastating. And it's interesting that around that time were reports that Turkey seemed about to give up its sovereignty. From Turkish history, we know that the fall of the Ottoman Empire was about 82 years later, so that's challenging. And a couple of friends of mine have worked hard at both the history and the text to try to demonstrate Litch's position, and they came up with differing conclusions. So I would support it if I could. But after 35 years of study of the trumpets, I have not seen either the textual or the historical evidence that to me is compelling enough to give it support.
Let me fine-tune the inspiration issue and ask a question with this. It is one thing to say that God reveals truth, and his truth is always 100% accurate, but when mixed with the human prophet, the product may be a growth process. Ellen White says, I've been constantly learning for 60 years. So God's method of truth is constant, but the prophet is growing, so therefore the overall product, which is a blend of the two, will grow. But are there actually times when God himself reveals things in a less than completely full way? Because that's what people can only handle at that time, or it serves a purpose at a particular time. And so God, even though he knows the full truth, sees it from above, he says, let me accommodate my version of the truth down to what needs to be helpful at this particular time, and I will clarify later. Which of those two models really is what's happening?
Well, if you read chapter 2 of my book, The Deep Things of God, what I sought to do there was to study fulfilled prophecy in the Bible. In other words, how does God move from promise to fulfillment? And I discovered 3 things about God. And truly, I did not expect this. Number 1, God is consistent. So there's a pattern between what he says and what he does, between what he does here and does again there. There's a pattern. There's something consistent there. Second of all, God does not always fulfill every detail. There are details of the prophecies that don't get fulfilled. And you can see this in multiple places. If you need an example, just read Isaiah 11, 15, and 16, where you have a 4-point prophecy that is fulfilled later on in the Bible, but every detail is changed because the circumstances changed. The third thing is that God is creative, and God can do something that wasn't prophesied as part of the fulfillment. And so the challenge, that's why Jesus says in John 14:29, that I tell you ahead of time so that when it happens, you will know. When it happens, you'll know. The best time to assess how a prophecy will turn out is at the time of fulfillment.
Okay.
Ahead of time, messianic prophecies. Jesus is a king like David. Well, does that mean he's going to commit adultery or murder 201 innocent people? Okay. He's a king like David. When he comes, you'll see the patterns with David. He's a prophet like Moses. Is he going to go around beating rocks with a stick? Okay. When he comes, you can see how he fulfills Moses. So
Really?
there's a level of openness to prophecy that God chooses to fulfill according to the circumstances. Yeah.
There's the famous story with Ellen White having a vision about Jupiter and the moons. You're all familiar with this story? Where Joseph Bates doubted Ellen White's prophetic gift. And then she went into prophecy one Sabbath afternoon, I think, and said how many moons there were around Jupiter, and gave the view that was current at the time. Joseph Bates says, okay, I accept her prophecy, big gift, because she wouldn't know that, but he knew that because he's an astronomer as a ship's captain. And I think it was 7 moons at the time. Later on, it was known to be 9. But if Ellen White had seen 9, it would have destroyed Joseph Bates' trust in
Well, right now, I think it's 68 or something.
in the 60s.
Yeah.
So God accommodated what he knows. He sees all. He knows exactly the number.
Wow.
But he accommodates that down to what it would work in this particular moment. And he's willing to be misunderstood and have someone doubt. Because how can he give the wrong number? He gave the wrong number in order to fit the truth at the time that needed. Are you okay with this view of prophecy? And could it be that God then uses Josiah Litch's, and it was a thing in the movement, and God uses it. He uses the dark day of 1780, which was a forest fire, to wake people up as a sign of Christ's coming. I think there's no question it was a forest fire, not an apocalyptic event only by God, but it woke people up and it made people study the Bible. Are we okay, or are we off on this?
Well, in a letter of 1912, written by Willie White, but signed by Ellen White, I agree with what's in here. He says, my mother never claimed to be an expert in history. You see? So whenever somebody came up with a new historian and a new approach, she says, change it. Just go ahead and change. These were illustrations of something bigger that God had given to her. So the question is the power of Ellen White's ministry in the quality of her history? Clearly not. Is it in the quality of her biblical exegesis? She rarely does it. And whenever she does it, you can almost be certain that it will be quoted or copied from someone else who does exegesis. So when you go to the testimonies, you don't see exegesis, you don't see history, you don't see science, you don't even see prophecy there. Her mission, so we're trying to understand what was Ellen White's mission within the Seventh-day Adventist movement. Her mission appears to be a call to faithfulness, a call to faithfulness in every detail of life. And that's why you see her focus on real people, real struggles, real details of life. And to take an offhand comment, even in a popular book like Great Controversy, and say, this settles the meaning of the Greek text, I think is taking beyond what her actual mission was.
So now to go to how you and others have interpreted it as a point in time, what happened in that point, will happen or is happening in that point of time. This is now back to the theme of secularism and atheism.
Well, I would understand that the point in time here is naturally connected to the point in time in chapter 10, when the angel raises his right hand to heaven and swears time will be no more. That there's a point in time when Daniel's time prophecies have been completed. And at that point in history, you're entering a decisive final era.
Fascinating.
So that's the point in time I would see here. Seventh-day Adventists have understood that point in time to be the year 1844. And so if that is the case, then we are living in the final era of Earth's history, and that's significant. That's significant for every generation.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, how is that playing these days in the younger generation, the whole idea that Jesus' coming is near?
I think you have to ask yourself if we discussed enough about what Schiffer brought up last time, post-Christian nations. So I don't know if young people who are not biblically literate or part of a church community or have a Christian background, if they're even considering the significance of Jesus coming again. I think that's probably maybe the problem. I don't know what you think on that, Vienna.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the conversations that we have nowadays, that's not a common theme as it maybe was when we were growing up, listening to our parents, going to the Revelation seminars and Jesus at the end time. And so, yeah, I don't see it as a common thread in our conversations nowadays. Of course, I'm not talking to everyone, but the ones that I am talking to, that's not at the forefront.
Yeah. I think if we were going to actually live by a front-loaded concept, I think understanding that Jesus coming again would probably be the most important thing to consider going throughout your life as a young person. This means how I live today affects the future. And I know that we're not talking about necessarily a works-based system of salvation, but that what I do, what I think, what I say does affect the future and can affect others negatively or for the blessing. You know, I know we're not in Revelation 10, but I mean there is this call to, hey, go out and profess that there is still something yet to come. Go out again and keep speaking. Go out again and keep teaching. And so I think for young people today, man, that's something that really should be emphasized. Like, He is coming again. Think about how you're living. Think about what you're talking about. Yeah. What are you being entertained by? Again, not based on for what you're going to be saved for, because we know that's by faith. But how does it affect the future?
Does it make a difference when people are hurting? I mean, we have a young girl who's graduating this weekend from high school who has cancer really everywhere.
Wow.
And we love her to death. I baptized her father this weekend. Doesn't that, but maybe if you don't have any of those things, who cares? I'm good. But boys, I want that to be done. I am tired of those kinds of stories. 17 years old, and you got to go have a PET scan, and there's cancer everywhere.
Oh, man.
And now you got to start chemo. You don't know, and the parent don't know. Will she finish college? Will she get married? Will she ever have a child? Will she? And the mother said to me, I want her to have some of those milestones, and she may not.
Yeah.
Doesn't that say, I would like this world of this to somehow be better? Or if people haven't had any suffering, then who cares?
But here's the thing. If Seventh-day Adventists were correct in 1844, that we are entering the last era of Earth's history. Why are we still here? How would you answer? Why are we still here?
Prophetic time.
Prophetic time?
Yeah.
The unknown. We don't know how long that era is going to last, I guess. I'm pulling out my best explanation.
That's where I would go
Right?
too.
What
Like,
would
how
you-
long is an era?
How long is an era? Soon and very soon, we are going to see the King. Soon. Like, soon is defined prophetically.
But if it's gone 150 years, then the idea of saying it's got to be in your generation starts sounding a little flat.
I certainly hope it would be in our generation, but that's what, I mean, my parents' generation also said. That's what, grandparents' generation said. So at what point do we reassess and say, are we wrong, or do we need to live within expectation every generation?
Well, I think one of the advantages of not having that soon so clear is I feel I would fall into these pitfalls of wanting to know when that day is so that I can put my calendar in accordance to this date, as opposed to, focusing on what you were saying, that, bigger narrative of Jesus, how are we aligning our faith, and, how are we focusing on these inward things. I think I would get stuck on that detail and be fixated on it.
Yeah. I think there was one really great sermon that I heard where the pastor was did a whole series on just saying, hey, I know how we're thinking about the end times. I know that everyone always wants to say, the Lord's coming soon, but he hasn't come. Therefore, how do we live now? Mm-hmm. And the idea was taking from a text where it said, be ever ready.
Yes.
At all times. Live in an audience of one between you and the Lord, and always have your heart ready.
And I think that resonates really well with the millennial generation and the Gen Zs that are coming up, because it's more so about like the kingdom here and now, right? Mm-hmm. The love of God experience today, the difference that we can make now.
Yes.
So that's where we meet our generation, we meet the growing mind there, and then we inspire this this fixation on the meaning of now and God's love today and how it impacts my present life, with hope for the future. Because I think we have a generation that's like super pumped to fight against the oppression, like whether it's personal or systemic. But I think the nice like pastoral moment for me is when I can meet them there, but then they catch the idea that they can't do this alone. They need an intervention from God. They need a coming soon.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They need the soon coming
like that.
of our Savior. That's when it all comes together.
The time has come, my friends.
Okay.
We wrestled with one of the hardest questions in Revelation today. So thank you for being with us, this whole issue of the time. We'll try to go on with the sixth trumpet next week. And there are some challenging verses in there too. If you'd like to react to this today, please send us an email, gps@llbn.tv. God bless.